This video covers the working memory model by Baddeley and Hitch, which is part of the content section of your cognitive psychology specification. Now, Baddeley and Hitch agreed with the idea of the multi-store model. They were quite happy with the idea that memory is separated into three separate stores: a sensory store, a short-term store, and a long-term memory. However, the aspect that they contested is that short-term memory is just one store. They suggested that it has different aspects, different parts to the short-term memory that needed to be explained. So, Baddeley and Hitch suggested that the short-term memory must have more than one component in it, and it's a lot more complicated than just suggesting that it's one blank store. They suggested that short-term memory as a source is almost like a workspace where lots of different operations are carried out in order to ensure old and new memories are encoded. Crucially for the model, they said that the two tasks that can be carried out simultaneously in the short-term memory suggested that there were different parts of the short-term memory, and that explained why two different tasks could be completed at the same time. Now, the example that Baddeley and Hitch give is, if I was to say to you, I want you to think about how many windows there are in your house, and you can take a second to do that if you want to, and then jot down the answer on a piece of paper. Now, Baddeley and Hitch suggest that in order for you to be able to do that, most people will conjure up a visual image of their house into their head and go around and count the number of windows. So, for example, you imagine your hallway, you'll walk down the hallway, you'll go into each room and count the numbers. Now, they said that your central executive is what makes the decision of what you need to do in order to be able to answer that question. Therefore, it almost generates and runs the strategy. It then passes that down into two slave systems, the phonological loop and the Visuospatial Sketchpad. Now, it's the Visuospatial Sketchpad that conjures up the image of your house in your head. That's how you're able to visualize and see your house in order to walk through it. And your phonological loop is the counting that you can hear yourself doing in your head every time you identify a window. Now, if we move the pictures, you can see this. This is the figure that Baddeley and Hitch suggest of the working memory. So we've got the central executive at the top, but I want you to think about that almost like the boss system. Now, from there, we've got two slave systems coming down. So we've got the Visuospatial Sketchpad, which is predominantly in charge of your spatial and visual information, and it's often called the inner eye. As we just discussed with the window example, it's what allows you to visualize images within your mind. The phonological loop down here contains two subsystems, and that's the articulatory control system, which is the inner voice, and the phonological store, which is the inner ear. So if you think about when you hear information, what you hear is within your phonological store, and your voice is almost the voice inside your head that you can hear talking. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So, the central executive. Now, the central executive, as I suggested before, is like the boss. It's the supervisory component that has overall control over short-term memory, and it has a limited capacity. Now, it's responsible for a range of important control processes. So when you need to do a task, it will decide which of the two slave systems the information needs to belong in, or which of the two slave systems will carry out the task. The central executive controls our attention and will choose between switching our attention for different tasks. It will also retrieve processes for memories from the long-term memory and coordinate the activity needed to carry out more than one processing task at the same time. So, like I say, the central executive is the core component, which is on top of the two slave systems, which can be used as storage. It frees up some of its own capacity in order to be able to deal with the more demanding information processing tasks, and then suggests that the two slave systems have separate responsibilities which work independently of each other. So, the phonological loop, which is sometimes called the articulatory phonological loop, and it has the two stores as we've just seen on the diagram. We have the articulatory control system, which is the inner voice, and the phonological store, which is the inner. So if we look at the phonological store is the temporary storage system for holding verbal information in a speech-based form. Now, it will only hold sounds for about 1 to 2 seconds, and that's why we say it has a limited capacity. It's particularly concerned with speech perception, which means that it's interested in the sounds of items. So if I was doing an experiment now where I asked you to remember the words pin, cat, sat, mat, house, and then I asked you to remember the words hippopotamus, tuberculosis, opportunity, refrigerator, university, you'll find it a lot easier to remember the shorter words because you can remember them with your inner ear. You've got time to repeat them with your inner voice, but the longer words are much harder to remember because you can't hold them in an auditory form in enough time to repeat them to yourself. So that's just an example of how the phonological store would work. If we now look at the articulatory control system, which is the aspect here within the phonological loop, words here are maintained by subvocal repetition. So that's when you hear your voice in your head repeating things. So you'll say cat sat mat within your head. Now it rehearses and stores verbal information from the phonological store, and this is the part of the store which is controlled with the speech production. Now it has limited capacity, as we've talked about before, because it's only a temporary storage system. Now, the Visuospatial Sketchpad, which is also sometimes called a scratchpad, but sketchpad is fine, and this is the aspect of working memory that's referred to as the inner eye, because this is specialised for spatial or visual coding, and it's kind of a writing pad for visual data. Now, again, it's got a limited capacity, it's a temporary memory system, but it allows us to visualise things within our mind. So if I asked you to count the posters in your bedroom, you would visually conjure an image of your bedroom, imagine it, and then work through and count the posters. A little bit of a summary here, because I understand that there's a lot of detail gone into that. So the central executive directs attention to particular tasks. It controls the other system by determining how resources will be allocated. So think of the control tower at an airport. The phonological loop controls the auditory information, which is divided into the phonological store, which is the inner ear, and the articulatory control process, which is the inner voice. We've then got the Visuospatial Sketchpad, which processes the visual and spatial information, so how things look and where they are. And then this bottom bit here is a new bit that Baddeley and Hitch introduced to the working memory at a later stage, which is the episodic buffer. Now they explain this as a general store added later to the model to account for things that use both visual and acoustic information. Now let's look at some evidence for the working memory model. Now a lot of the evidence comes from case studies, and it's important for you to remember that a case study is a detailed study of one individual or an event. So if we look at the case of HF now, in the 1970s, KF was in a motorcycle accident which resulted in brain damage in his left occipital lobe, which is pictured and highlighted on the picture here. Now his short-term memory was damaged and he only had a digit span of 1, but his long-term memory was normal. He remembered words if they were better presented visually as opposed to auditorily, and that's the bit that's really, really important. Because although the short-term memory and the long-term memory being separate stores, in order for one to be damaged and the other one to work fine, so his short-term memory was damaged but his long-term memory worked fine, totally supports the idea of the multi-store model in the sense that they're separate stores. However, in using KF as evidence for the working memory model, it's interesting that if he remembers words, if they're presented to him visually rather than auditorily, so rather than listening to them, that supports the idea of the working memory because it suggests that the auditory store and the visual store must be two separate stores for one to be damaged and for the other to be working. Now, the evaluation of the working memory model. So the model has been extremely influential, and most cognitive psychologists now accept this and they use the working memory in preference to using the multi-store model. It's much more plausible than the multi-store because it explains the complexity of short-term memory, and it explains both the temporary storage but also the active processing that goes on within short-term memory. It incorporates verbal rehearsal as just one optional process within the articulatory control loop instead of being the sole means of transferring information as suggested by Atkinson and Schifrin. Now, this means if you visualize the multi-store model, the only way to get information from the short-term memory into the long-term memory store was by full rehearsal, whereas working memory suggests that that is just one process. It's possible to apply the model to previous research data, so a lot of the information that supports the idea of multi-store can also be applied to support the idea of working memory model as well. It accounts for findings that are much more difficult for the multi-store model to explain, so this idea of some selective memory deficits found in brain damage patients, such as the case of KF that we just discussed. However, working memory model also accounts for the individual differences in memory processes, and it can be applied to various real-life settings. So because there is a high correlation between working memory span and then performance on various tasks, it's been suggested that the working memory capacity might be used as a measure for suitability for certain jobs. So it's worth noting that the working memory model is tested as a recruitment tool in order to be able to join the US Air Force. However, working memory models do not offer a complete understanding of how memory works, and the exact role played by the central executive remains very, very unclear, and other researchers have questioned whether it can be a single component or whether there are still separate verbal and spatial working memory systems. Cowan suggested that in order to explain abilities such as text comprehension, working memory should also encompass some kind of long-term memory activation tool. It's also been criticised for failing to account for musical memory because we're able to listen to instrumental music without impairing performance on other acoustic tasks. So think about the idea of being able to listen to music while performing other tasks. It's very difficult at this stage within the new specification to understand how working memory model will be tested within your exam, but from the SAMS materials they seem to focus on scenarios, as do obviously the other working memories, or they seem to ask you specifically to identify the features of the central executive, the phonological loop, and the Visuospatial Sketchpad. It also seems to focus on the idea that certain stores can be overloaded, and therefore that explains why we can't do two tasks at the same time. So, for example, an example question is: Candice is listening to the lyrics of her favourite band, Lipstick Lollipop, when her mother asks her to go to the shop to buy milk and eggs. When Candice goes to the shop, she realises she can't remember what her mother sent her to buy. On the way home, she tries to sing the new Lipstick Lollipop song, but she can't remember the lyrics either. Now, a different example is, and this is directly from the SAMS, is Rasheen found it difficult to revise while listening to music, and Rasheen's teacher said that it's because the working memory model could explain this. So explain the working memory model in terms of why Rasheen found it difficult to revise while listening to music. Now, if we look at the mark scheme for this, it's only a 3-mark question, and it wants 3 quite simple basic points. So, for example, outlining that working memory model splits the short-term memory into different parts, including the phonological loop. But by listening to music and trying to revise at the same time, Rasheen is overloading the phonological loop because she's trying to use that to complete 2 activities at the same time. Because the phonological loop has limited capacity, Rasheen can't cope with 2 auditory tasks at the same time, and therefore she finds it difficult to revise. Nice and simple, straightforward, 3 marks.